Jasmine King took a deep breath as she walked into Westfield High's English class for the first time. She felt the weight of being new in the room, filled with faces already familiar with each other. Miss Roberts, the teacher, stood at the front, arms crossed, gaze critical, and as soon as Jasmine stepped into the classroom, that gaze focused on her. Jasmine could feel the unspoken judgment, a silent analysis she wasn't meant to notice but couldn't ignore. "Everyone, it seems we have a new addition," Miss Roberts said, her voice slow and dripping with a peculiar kind of politeness. "Jasmine, right? I hope you're prepared for our rigorous curriculum." Her tone held an edge, an expectation that Jasmine might not be. The way Miss Roberts emphasized rigorous made it feel more like a challenge than a welcome. Jasmine nodded, her expression steady, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. She could feel some students watching, a few sympathetic glances, others indifferent or mildly entertained by the exchange. But Jasmine kept her focus, determined not to let anyone see her unease. She made her way to an empty desk and sat down, gripping her notebook tightly. As class started, Jasmine noticed that Miss Roberts often threw glances her way, as if assessing how much she belonged there. The subject for the day was To Kill a Mockingbird. "This classic novel," Miss Roberts announced, "is one of America's most important discussions on justice and morality. We'll be dissecting themes of innocence and societal values. Does anyone have initial thoughts?" Jasmine raised her hand, feeling prepared to dive into the discussion. But Miss Roberts looked right past her, calling on a different student who shared a surface-level analysis. Jasmine lowered her hand, but the small sting lingered. When she tried again later, Miss Roberts raised an eyebrow and finally acknowledged her. "Yes, Jasmine. What do you think?" Jasmine took a breath. "I think the novel does a powerful job showing how deeply embedded racial prejudice affects society and the characters. Atticus Finch's efforts to stand up against it show." But Miss Roberts cut her off, her tone clipped. "That's an interesting interpretation," she interrupted. "But remember, it's just a novel. I'd rather we not bring our modern social views into it." She paused, glancing around as if expecting approval. Some students looked at Jasmine sympathetically, others shrugged, while a few smirked. Jasmine clenched her notebook. She had prepared for this discussion, but it seemed Miss Roberts had little interest in what she had to say. Miss Roberts moved on without looking back, leaving Jasmine to simmer silently at her desk. The days passed, and Jasmine grew increasingly frustrated with Miss Roberts' bad treatment. Each class felt like a battle between asserting her voice and being silenced, a struggle she fought quietly but determinedly. During a group project, Miss Roberts assigned Jasmine to work with a few classmates who had reputations for being uninterested. It was a pointed decision, and Jasmine could sense the implication. She was meant to feel unwelcome, out of place, and isolated. That afternoon, Jasmine decided to talk to her father, Mr. King, about it. Sitting across from him at the dinner table, she hesitated before speaking, unsure how to explain the situation without sounding dramatic. "Dad, I feel like my teacher, Miss Roberts. Well, it feels like she's just not interested in anything I say. She dismisses me every time I try to add to the discussion." Mr. King put down his fork, his expression serious. "Has she said anything specifically rude or unkind?" Jasmine shook her head, trying to articulate it. "No, it's not what she says, it's the way she says it. The way she looks past me or questions everything I say. Like today we were talking about To Kill a Mockingbird, and I brought up the issue of racism in the book. She cut me off and told me not to impose my own agenda on the discussion." Her father's face tightened. He knew his daughter well, and he had witnessed her strong sense of justice and passion for learning. "Do you think it's something personal, Jasmine?" "I don't know," Jasmine replied, her voice soft. "But it doesn't feel right. It's like she sees me as different, and that bothers her." Mr. King nodded slowly. "Well, I'll be paying closer attention, Jasmine. Keep being respectful, but don't let anyone silence you, especially when you know you're right. The next week during a class discussion, Jasmine raised her hand, her thoughts clear and prepared. But as she began to speak, Miss Roberts interrupted her yet again. Jasmine's frustration flared, and she paused, hesitating for a moment before continuing, her voice more determined. "With all due respect, Miss Roberts," Jasmine said, her tone carefully measured, "I think my perspective is relevant to understanding the book. Ignoring the themes of racial injustice is dismissing a major part of the story." The entire class fell silent, the air heavy with tension. Miss Roberts' lips tightened as she processed Jasmine's words, her expression hardening. "Well," she said, her voice colder than usual, "maybe at your previous school these kinds of perspectives were acceptable, but here we focus on a broader academic understanding. I suggest you save personal opinions for other contexts." Jasmine felt a twist of anger and humiliation but held herself together. She returned to her seat, eyes lowered, but her fists clenched. Her classmates glanced around awkwardly, some looking sympathetic, others sharing smirks, feeding off the teacher's hostility. At the end of the class, as the students were filing out, Miss Roberts called out, "Jasmine, stay behind for a moment." Jasmine froze. She gathered her books and slowly approached Miss Roberts' desk, her expression guarded. "Yes, Miss Roberts?" Miss Roberts looked her up and down, a smug smile tugging at her lips. "I hope you understand, Jasmine, that this class has standards that require discipline and a certain level of academic maturity. If you're unable to meet those standards, perhaps you should consider finding a learning environment better suited to your personal interests." Jasmine's cheeks flushed, a mix of embarrassment and anger swirling within her. "With respect, Miss Roberts," she said quietly, "I believe I am meeting those standards. I'm doing my best to contribute thoughtfully." Miss Roberts raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Well, if that's your best, perhaps you should reflect on whether you truly belong in a class like this." Jasmine took a deep breath, biting back the sharp retort that bubbled up in her mind. She nodded curtly, her voice firm but measured. "Thank you, Miss Roberts. I'll keep that in mind." As she turned to leave, she felt the weight of her teacher's scrutiny pressing on her back. But she kept her head high, determined not to let Miss Roberts see how deeply her words had cut. Outside, the hallway bustled with students, but Jasmine felt a strange distance from the chatter and laughter. The world around her felt somehow muted, as if she were watching it from behind a thick glass. She clenched her fists, knowing that she couldn't stay silent forever. As Jasmine left the classroom that afternoon, she felt the burn of frustration and humiliation linger long after Miss Roberts' parting words. She walked with her head held high, but inside a storm brewed, pulling her thoughts in every direction. She hated how Miss Roberts made her feel so small and questioned if she was doing the right thing by speaking up. That evening, Jasmine sat in her room, replaying the day's events over in her mind. The confrontation with Miss Roberts weighed on her heavily, and despite her best efforts, her confidence felt fractured. She felt a knock on her door. "Come in," she called softly, already knowing it was her father. Mr. King stepped inside, his expression calm but tinged with concern. "Jasmine," he said gently, taking a seat beside her, "I can see something's bothering you. Do you want to talk about it?" Jasmine looked at him, hesitating for a moment before letting out a long sigh. "Dad, it's just that every time I try to say something in class, it feels like Miss Roberts is already against me. Today, she actually told me that maybe I didn't belong in her class." Mr. King's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "And how did that make you feel?" "Angry," Jasmine admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "and embarrassed. It's like no matter how hard I try, it's not enough. I know I'm doing my best, but she makes me feel like I don't deserve to be there." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Jasmine, you know that your voice matters, don't you? She nodded but looked away. Sometimes I'm not sure. It's like she's trying to break me down, and maybe she's right. Maybe I'm just causing trouble. No, Mr. King replied, his tone firm. You're not causing trouble by standing up for what's right. You have every right to be in that class, and no one, not even Miss Roberts, has the authority to make you feel otherwise. You're stronger than you know, Jasmine. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Jasmine looked up at him, her resolve slowly returning. Thanks, Dad. Anytime, he said, offering her a small, encouraging smile. But remember, this isn't a battle you have to fight alone. The following week, the classroom atmosphere grew tenser with each passing day. Miss Roberts' dismissive attitude toward Jasmine became more pronounced, and it was no longer a subtle tension that only Jasmine felt. Other students were beginning to notice, too. One day after class, Sarah, a quiet student who had always sat in the front row, approached Jasmine as she packed up her things. Jasmine, Sarah said hesitantly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Miss Roberts was out of earshot. I wanted to say that I've been noticing how she treats you, and it's not fair. Jasmine looked at her in surprise, her guard dropping slightly. Thanks, Sarah. I thought maybe it was just me. Sarah shook her head. No, it's not just you. I think a lot of us have noticed. We didn't know what to do. She's the teacher, you know? Jasmine nodded, understanding the unspoken fear. I get it. She has all the power and speaking up feels risky. Sarah nodded, looking down. But I think it's wrong, Jasmine, and if you need someone to stand with you, I'd be there. Jasmine smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you know. Sarah returned her smile, and in that moment, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't entirely alone, and that knowledge strengthened her resolve. A week later, Jasmine was preparing for a class presentation on To Kill a Mockingbird. She had poured hours of work into it, carefully analyzing the themes and drawing connections to issues of racial injustice, both in the novel and in the world around her. She was nervous, but ready to share her insights. As she took her place in front of the class, her heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet Miss Roberts' gaze. She began her presentation, speaking confidently and clearly, but as she reached the part about the novel's exploration of prejudice and inequality, Miss Roberts interrupted her. Jasmine, she said, her voice sharp. I have to ask, don't you think you're overemphasizing certain themes here? Jasmine's brows furrowed slightly. I don't think so, Miss Roberts. Harper Lee wrote this book specifically to address issues of racial injustice. Miss Roberts cut her off with a dismissive wave of her hand. I understand that's your interpretation, but I think you're seeing something that isn't there. Let's keep this discussion academic rather than political. A murmur went through the room, and Jasmine felt her cheeks flush. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and spoke again, her voice firm. With respect, Miss Roberts, this novel is deeply rooted in issues of racial inequality. Ignoring that would be overlooking a major part of the story. Miss Roberts' face hardened, and she stood, her posture rigid. That's enough, Jasmine. Take your seat. If you can't follow the curriculum, then perhaps this isn't the right environment for you. The room fell silent, and Jasmine felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She hesitated, feeling a mix of shame and anger, but then she looked over at Sarah, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Jasmine took a steadying breath and met Miss Roberts' gaze head-on. I'm sorry, Miss Roberts, she said, her voice unwavering, but I believe in what I'm saying, and I'm not going to apologize for that. A gasp rippled through the classroom, and Miss Roberts' face flushed with anger. Jasmine King, that's enough. Stay after class. We need to have a serious conversation about your attitude. Jasmine held her ground, refusing to back down. She had reached her breaking point, and she wasn't going to let Miss Roberts silence her any longer. After class, Jasmine stayed behind as requested, her nerves frayed, but her resolve solid. Miss Roberts looked at her with a barely disguised look of irritation. "Jasmine," she began, her voice cold, "I have tried to be patient with you, but your behavior is disruptive. You need to learn that your opinions aren't always appropriate, especially when they interfere with the classroom environment." Jasmine held her gaze, her voice quiet but strong. "I don't believe I'm being disruptive, Miss Roberts. I'm contributing my perspective, just like any other student." Miss Roberts scoffed. "Perhaps in your previous school, this kind of insubordination was tolerated. But here, we expect students to respect authority and keep their personal opinions out of academic discussions." Jasmine felt the anger bubbling up again, but she forced herself to stay calm. "With respect, Miss Roberts, I don't think my views are out of line. They're directly relevant to the text we're studying." Miss Roberts leaned forward, her tone dripping with condescension. "Then perhaps, Jasmine, you should reconsider whether you truly belong in this class." Jasmine's fists clenched, but she stayed silent, refusing to give Miss Roberts the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. That evening, she told her father everything. Mr. King listened intently, his expression darkening with every word. When Jasmine finished, he gave a curt nod. "Jasmine, this has gone on long enough," he said, his tone resolute. "I'll be having a conversation with Miss Roberts myself." The next morning, Mr. King entered Miss Roberts' classroom just before the lesson began. He addressed the class, his voice calm but commanding. "Good morning, everyone. I'm here to observe today's class," he announced, his gaze briefly meeting Miss Roberts. "I'd like to see how discussions are conducted and to ensure that all students are being treated fairly." Miss Roberts paled but managed a forced smile. "Of course, Mr. King. We were just about to continue with our analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird." As the class discussion unfolded, Mr. King watched closely, taking note of Miss Roberts' interactions with each student. When Jasmine raised her hand to contribute, Miss Roberts hesitated before calling on her, her voice noticeably colder than with other students. As Jasmine spoke, Miss Roberts interrupted her, dismissing her points yet again. Mr. King's expression remained calm, but a flicker of anger passed through his eyes. When Jasmine finished, he addressed the class. "Jasmine brought up an excellent point," he said, his voice steady. "I think it's important that we allow every student to express their views, especially on topics as crucial as justice and equality." Miss Roberts' expression tightened, but she nodded stiffly. Mr. King's presence had clearly shaken her, and for the rest of the lesson, her usual dismissive attitude toward Jasmine was noticeably restrained. By the end of the class, Jasmine felt a sense of quiet victory. Her father had stood up for her, and even though the battle wasn't over, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. After Mr. King's visit, a shift took place in the classroom. Jasmine noticed that Miss Roberts was less openly dismissive, yet her eyes still held an edge of resentment whenever she looked in Jasmine's direction. She seemed almost wary now, careful in her responses to Jasmine, but Jasmine could sense the forced politeness beneath. That afternoon, Sarah caught up with Jasmine in the hallway. She looked around cautiously before speaking. "Jasmine, I wanted to say, what you did back there, standing up to her, that was brave. And your dad, he was amazing. I think we're all starting to see things a little differently," she said, her voice soft but earnest. Jasmine gave her a grateful smile. "Thanks, Sarah. It hasn't been easy, but I'm glad people are starting to notice." A few more classmates began to approach Jasmine in the following days, offering supportive nods or stopping to chat in the hallways. For the first time since the start of the semester, Jasmine felt a sense of belonging at Westfield High. She realized that by standing up, she hadn't just gained respect, she had also given others the courage to speak out. Inspired by recent events, Jasmine decided to channel the momentum into something positive. She approached Sarah with an idea. "I want to start a club," Jasmine said, her eyes alight with determination. A space where we can talk about what's happening in the world and in this school without judgment or dismissal. Sarah's face brightened. That's an amazing idea. I know other students who would love to join. They met with the school administration, who, to Jasmine's surprise, were supportive of the initiative. Within a week, the Cultural Awareness Club was established, and Jasmine found herself at the center of something she hadn't anticipated: a movement for change. On the day of the first meeting, the classroom was packed. Students filled every seat, and a few even stood at the back. Jasmine and Sarah led the discussion, creating a safe space for students to share their experiences and ideas. During the meeting, a student named Miguel spoke up. "I never thought I'd be able to talk about this stuff openly, but seeing you stand up, Jasmine, it made me realize that we shouldn't have to hide what we're feeling." Jasmine felt a surge of pride and humility. "Thank you, Miguel. This is what the club is for all of us to be heard." The meeting ended with a feeling of unity and purpose, and Jasmine knew that they were making a real difference, not just in her life, but in the lives of her classmates. Meanwhile, Miss Roberts had grown increasingly isolated. The students' shift in loyalty hadn't gone unnoticed, and she could feel her grip on authority slipping. Determined to regain control, she decided to bring her concerns to the principal's office. She sat across from Mr. King, her posture rigid. "Mr. King," she began, her voice tense, "I've noticed that Jasmine's influence has become disruptive. This club she started, it's stirring up emotions that are frankly distracting students from their academic work." Mr. King listened calmly, nodding as she spoke. "Miss Roberts, the Cultural Awareness Club was approved by the administration, and it's entirely voluntary. I don't believe Jasmine is disrupting anything. She's simply providing a space for students to express themselves." Miss Roberts's face hardened, but she tried to keep her tone respectful. "Mr. King, don't you think this has gone far enough? Jasmine's strong opinions might be better suited elsewhere." Mr. King's expression darkened, his tone unyielding. "Miss Roberts, my daughter has done nothing but express her thoughts in an appropriate manner. If anything, this club is helping students feel more connected to the school. Your job as a teacher is to encourage growth, not silence it." Miss Roberts looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. She could feel her position slipping, but she held her tongue, knowing that any further objections might cost her the very job she was so desperate to hold on to. Following her failed meeting with Mr. King, Miss Roberts began to notice that more students were joining Jasmine's cause. Small but significant changes were taking place within the school. A more open environment in classrooms, discussions that encouraged students to share personal perspectives without fear. Unable to cope with the changes, Miss Roberts submitted a formal complaint to the school board, accusing Mr. King of favoritism and claiming that Jasmine's club was fostering disruption in the school. The administration took her complaint seriously and arranged a meeting to address the matter. On the day of the meeting, Jasmine sat in the office beside her father, her nerves stretched thin. Miss Roberts sat across from them, her expression guarded. The board chair, Mrs. Phillips, began the meeting with a stern look. "Miss Roberts, we understand that you've brought up concerns regarding Mr. King's involvement and Jasmine's club. Could you clarify?" Miss Roberts launched into her complaints, carefully choosing her words. "I believe Mr. King's position as both a principal and Jasmine's father is creating a conflict of interest. Jasmine's club has encouraged students to speak out in ways that disrupt the academic focus of my classroom." Mr. King listened quietly before speaking. "I appreciate your concerns, Miss Roberts, but I believe Jasmine's club is providing students with a much-needed voice. Our school's mission is to cultivate critical thinking and empathy. I believe Jasmine's club aligns with these values." Jasmine felt a surge of pride at her father's words. She glanced at Miss Roberts, whose expression had turned sour, realizing that her accusations were failing to sway the administration. Mrs. Phillips leaned forward, addressing Miss Roberts directly. "Thank you, Miss Roberts, but after reviewing the students' feedback, we've concluded that the Cultural Awareness Club has had a positive impact on the school environment. We're committed to supporting it." Miss Roberts' face turned pale as the realization set in. Her attempts to undermine Jasmine had only solidified the club's position within the school. With the school board's support, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of purpose. She continued to lead the Cultural Awareness Club, which became a powerful platform for students to explore issues of justice, equality, and respect. Miss Roberts, on the other hand, grew increasingly isolated. Students avoided her class, and complaints from parents began to surface, questioning her teaching methods. Eventually, she faced disciplinary actions, and within weeks, the administration announced her departure from Westfield High. On her last day, Jasmine passed Miss Roberts in the hallway. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Jasmine saw a flicker of regret in her former teacher's expression. But Jasmine felt no satisfaction, only a quiet resolve. She had stood up not to punish anyone, but to make a difference, and she hoped Miss Roberts would one day understand the lessons she had missed. Jasmine's club grew, inspiring students across Westfield High to participate in meaningful discussions and take active roles in the school community. Diversity initiatives were introduced, and the administration committed to fostering an environment of inclusion and respect. One afternoon, as Jasmine walked through the bustling hallways, she overheard a group of younger students discussing the Cultural Awareness Club with enthusiasm. "You have to join. It's amazing. You get to learn so much about people's backgrounds and their stories," one student said, her eyes bright. Jasmine smiled to herself, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. The change she had worked for was taking root, not just for her classmates, but for future students as well. As the school year drew to a close, Jasmine reflected on everything she had endured and achieved. She had faced the weight of prejudice and injustice, but she had also found her voice, her strength, and a community that stood with her. One evening, as she and her father sat together on the front porch, Mr. King turned to her with a proud smile. "Jasmine, what you've done here, it's something truly remarkable. I hope you know that." She nodded, her heart full of gratitude. "I do, Dad. And I know there's more to do. But now, I know I have the strength to do it." Mr. King placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And you'll never have to do it alone." Jasmine looked out at the fading sunset, a sense of peace and hope washing over her. She had faced the worst, and in doing so had helped create a better world, not just for herself, but for everyone at Westfield High.